This is lecture number 3 in our series here of Zoom recordings. This lecture here is going to deal mostly with the culture of colonial America. I'm going to talk more about the people, what they're up to here in this time period. There might be a little bit of repeating in this from the other lectures, but that's okay. But this is the final lecture for the first exam. So this will get you ready to take the first exam. The culture of colonial North America, I'm going to divide it into 2 sections. You're going to have the South and the North, which are very separate during this time period, as we mentioned already. There were vast differences between the 2 regions from the very beginning. I want you to realize the class of people that we have here in the American South. You have that top 5%. The top 5% are the elites. They're mostly owners of plantations. Some of them are owners of merchant houses, mainly the deerskin trading houses were big in this time period here in the South. And this folks here are the upper class of the American South. This 5% also are slave owners. They do have large plantations during this time period, and so they are very much involved here with the use of slave labor in their societies. So you have the upper class people. They're owners of plantations. They're owners of shipping companies. They're also the owners of mercantile businesses across the South. Okay. You also are going to have in this group a small number of upper middle class, about 8% of the people that are yeoman farmers, are farmers. They're not quite the plantation elite, but they do own slaves. About 8% of the middle class do own slaves in this time period. So slavery across the South for the entire duration of the Old South until the Civil War time period, slavery is in the hands of about 15% of the people. Only about 15% of the Southern people actually have slaves. And most of them only have 3 or 4. If you're an artisan, you might have 1 or 2 slaves who helps you with your artisan business in this time period. So slavery is not that widespread as far as population is concerned. There's a large number of slaves, but a few people control the number of slaves that are in the South here in this time period. Okay, so you have that upper class, the owners of plantations, the owners of mercantile businesses. You have yeoman farmers who are up and coming. They're not quite there yet. They might have a few slaves in their households. But the South is a very different place, let's put it that way. And of course, they call slavery their particular institution. Okay, you had what was called the middle class. The middle class, of course, is like it is today. Same groups of people, school teachers, if you have any in your community. Your tutors were considered to be middle class. Your doctors, your lawyers, your shopkeepers or small shopkeepers. These were all middle class people. Yeoman farmers who are artisans were also middle class people. So if you're involved in a trade of some kind or got a shop of some kind or a small business of some kind, you're part of this middle class. And the middle class in the South consisted of close to about 40% of the people. About 40% of the people. So you have about 10% who are in the upper class. You have 40% who are in what is called the middle class. And then the third group of people, the ones we call the plain folks. Some people call them the cracker culture, and others call them the poor whites. These folks here are the people who are landless. They do not own land. They go from place to place. They're mostly squatters. They'll go into an area. They'll squat down here for a couple of years. They'll build a little log house of some kind, and they hunt for food. They don't usually grow gardens or have big mules or big horses or anything of this nature. They're just plain poor people is what they are. Of this number, you'll have some of them who are called crackers. These folks here are mostly herdsmen. They herd cattle. They herd hogs across the country. And so these are the ones who have very restrictive diets and so forth. Sometimes these poor white people will go to the plantations during the planting season and during harvest to get odd jobs. And they do that. And they are taken care of by the owners of plantations when they do so here. Okay. One of the biggest concerns for the owners of plantations, however, is when these poor white boys show up, they're looking at his girls, and he don't want his daughters marrying what he calls white trash during this time period. And so he tried to keep his girls all gathered up in the big house so they're not out there among all these young men who are visiting from other areas around the county, around the countryside. And so he tried to protect his girls. Well, that don't work out so well for him, because these girls will see these young boys out there, they'll point them out, and they'll talk about them and discuss them. And then the girls will kind of sneak around and get a chance to talk to them. They might throw a note out the window, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, a ladder appears on the side of the house, and somebody's escaping. That young man has got the ladder up there, she's coming down it, and they're out there going. And sometimes they do get married. And of course, this really makes the owner of the big house mad until the first child is born. When the first grandbaby comes along, the old man starts straightening up a little bit and is not so hateful as he was before. But you see this happening often here, of these young ladies of the plantation who are marrying these young boys from the lower class, and their fathers do not like this, because the fathers are controlling. They control everything here in this society. So don't mess with Big Daddy. Don't mess with the owner of the plantation, the old master. You could get in trouble. And I want you guys to remember also that women on the plantations here, women in this society, were governed by the men. The men oversaw the women. So the women were involved in a type of slavery also. And when they got married to these young men, the young men became their bosses. They became their beneficiaries. And a matter of fact, during this time period, you couldn't divorce. You couldn't divorce legally. Now, you might get separated, but you could not divorce each other. If you did divorce, the husband kept everything. The girl was thrown out. He kept the house, the kids, all the furniture, everything he kept. And she didn't have anything. So most girls realized they had to put up with it. And it's not a good life to have. It's very stressful, and these girls had a lot of issues here to deal with. I read a lot of diaries of these young women of this time period up until the 1860s, and these girls had some major mental issues because how the men treated them. They were not well cared for in some cases. They were not put on a pedestal as everybody thinks they were during the Renaissance and antebellum period. It didn't happen here. And so a lot of these girls were distressed and had mental issues to deal with, and trying to raise a number of kids and having so many kids. And it was crazy. And then, of course, you had if you was on a plantation, you had to worry about your husband out there in the slave quarters producing children. And then your older teenage boys going out there and producing children. So these women had very stressful lives here in this time period. So I want you guys to be aware of what's going on here in this time period. Okay, the whole system. If you're poor white, if you're middle class, if you're part of the plantation class, the upper class, the key word here for society is going to be white male supremacy. White male supremacy controlled the entire situation here in this time period. So to remember that white supremacy is very much a part of the system here across the South during the colonial period, and it's going to continue on for a long time. So it's part of it. The role of the women were the housekeepers. The house was theirs to take care of. And they would go and beg their husbands for new furniture. They'd go through and beg for new pots and pans or for new chinaware for the tables. They were always trying to find ways to improve the surroundings which they lived in. But the women are part of a cult of domesticity. And in this cult of domesticity means that the women pretty much control the household. They ran the houses here. And that was their authority. But remember, it's only the head woman who does this. Okay? And she also has some white supremacy over the help that's in the house. Okay, remember that most of the people in the house are going to be slaves, are going to be children of the old master from the slave quarters. So you're going to have all this to deal with here in this time period. Okay, so she oversees the cooking, the housekeeping, the cleaning, the washing of laundry here in this time period. She oversees a lot of different areas here, including trying to raise her daughters to be part of the elite class. Okay, so she is trying to be the actual person in charge of the house. Now, of course, the old master, he owns it, is his. And so he can step in and stop situations from happening. The major job of the old master is making sure that the plantation runs smoothly. He makes sure that the accounting is done correctly. He does have an accountant. He does have lawyers. He does have people that help him out. Sometimes he has slave people that he owns that's part of his entourage that takes care of the property, like overseers and so forth. And so the old master is in charge of making sure everything runs smoothly. He is the manager. He is the corporate head of all of this, and he does delegate. He does pass down different things that people have to do, and he makes them accountable for it. If they don't do what they want him, what he wants them to, and they're enslaved, he will whip them. He will go through and make them wish that they hadn't done what he wanted. And whippings took place in the evenings on plantations after the work was done. Anybody who didn't do enough production that day was facing a whipping, and that was very common here. Two of the most famous women that I can remember from the 1800s were the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. And they left their plantation home in South Carolina because they were tired of seeing the violence. They were tired of seeing all these people whipped and beaten and all the violence and all the hatred that took place on plantations. And they left. This is in the early 1820s. And they left and they went north. They went and joined a Quaker colony. And these ladies became spokespeople about slavery. They told people in the North how bad slavery was. They told them from a first-hand account. It was not somebody making stuff up. They told them exactly what it's like here in the South, and they realized that a lot of this plantation violence was a lot worse than what they realized it was. And so you have this going on, and violence was a key word here, guys. They used violence to control the workers here in the time period. Okay? You had the division of work that took place here on the plantations and then across the South. You did have your artisan blacksmith. You had artisan blacksmiths on the plantation. You had carpenters. You had coopers who made wooden barrels and also made wooden boxes. Okay, you had your millers, your sawyers, and your tanners. I mentioned these people before, and you'll see these in the yeoman society, middle class society. You'll see some of these people in the poor white society. Sometimes these people in the poor white society have been trained or been partially trained, and they're trying to do work of this nature from place to place. So you start seeing the artisan trades here. A barber was very important. There's a great book out about a barber who lived in Natchez during the 1820s. He was African American. He owned slaves, and he had a barber shop. And he did quite well. He had a large plantation. And so you start seeing people on the fringe starting to show signs of trying to become upper mobility or mobile to the upper classes of society during this time period here. Okay, I want you to realize something about this situation here in the American South. Only 95% of all the slaves in colonial America were in the American South. 95% of all the slaves were in the American South. 5% of the slaves were in northern areas. So the North did not have a real big slave population because they didn't have agricultural fields. They didn't have the work for slaves in the North. The South used these people regularly here as field hands. And of this 95% in the South, 90% were field hands. 90% of these people did work in the fields during this time period. And so you have a large number who work in these fields. As a matter of fact, a lot of these people are going to take last names when slavery ends. And a lot of these folks are going to take the name of their occupation they did on the plantation. So John, the blacksmith, becomes John Smith. And James, who's a carpenter, becomes James Carpenter. And Mike Sawyer, who's a sawyer, becomes Mike Sawyer. So you start seeing this, the name Miller, the name Sawyer, the name Tanner, the name Fields, the name Cotton, okay? The name Cain, these are common names here in America. And these names came from the jobs they did in the days of slavery. They went through and took the name of their jobs and made that their last name. They don't associate with the old master. And very few slaves did take the old master's last name. If your master was real good to you and you had no real situations as far as violence on the plantation, and you were well cared for, and you felt security in your jobs here, usually you did take your master's last name, but that is few and far between. Most of these guys are going to take the name of the jobs they did on the plantation when slavery has ended here in this time period. Okay, now the other 10% of slaves are going to be household servants. They're cooks, they do the laundry, okay? They're going to be the ones who take care of the water situation, the water supply, okay? They're going to be your porters. They're going to be your butlers in your houses. They're going to be your wagon drivers, okay? They're people in different occupations. And so in slavery, you had different levels of jobs than you did in white society, because people looked up to the one who's a butler in the house, or the chief cook on the plantation, or the one who was the wagon driver. He had a lot of prestige because he is the man they depend upon to take them to town and to other places on their wagons and on their buggies, on their carriages. And so you start seeing a major change here among the people here who are enslaved as far as work's concerned. You do have different levels of work here in this time period. If you guys will watch the documentary from HBO film, Unchained Memories, and that is on your Blackboard movie list that you can click on and watch, Oprah Winfrey and her entourage did a really good job explaining life on the plantation, the division of work, and so forth. And I would definitely watch that. That's one of the best programs I have watched in my teaching career that deals with the actual issue of slavery. And it's done in a very interesting manner. They use the slave narratives from the 1930s, and 1940s. These slave narratives were produced by the Roosevelt administration, and they went through and read the actual diary, the actual entries here in the slave narrative. So you got people who are enslaved that are telling you what it's like to be enslaved. And it's not a bunch of stuff that some people made up and just talk about. These are actual documentaries. These are actual documents. These are actual stories here in this time period. So guys, the American South is quite different from the American North. All right, in the North, only 5% of your people are slaves. 95% of your people are free people. The North is going to change all of this in 1819. In 1819, slavery up north is dissolved. They free the people up north from slavery, but they do not give them civil liberties or civil rights. They cannot vote in most places. They cannot sue in courts in most places. They have a hard time finding good jobs in most places. The North free their slaves, their small number of slaves, but they didn't do a whole lot to bring stability to them. And we'll discuss that later on in class 2. Now, in the North, you do have a pretty sizable upper class. It's close to about 15% of your people, which is a good number for an upper class civilization. These folks are large-scale artisans. They have large shops in which they build, in which they manufacture. And you're going to start seeing manufacturing take place in the North in the mid-1700s. And England had outlawed it, but people did it on the sly. They didn't do it publicly in front of the British. They didn't flaunt it. They did it among themselves. And of course, they used the barter system to trade with. So there's no British money being floating around. You can't trace by the money what's going on. And they just barter. They exchange goods for goods in this time period. This top 15%, of course, were your shippers. They owned large merchant houses. Okay. They were involved in the insurance business and financial institutions, things the South was not really into in this time period. They were also people who had large-scale fishing houses, people who are heavily involved in various kinds of fur businesses, the ones who are into shipbuilding. These are the ones who are your upper class here in the areas of New England and also in the mid-Atlantic states during this time period. Okay, they did have their middle class. The middle class looks like everybody else's middle class look. It's going to be about half your people, and the middle class is going to be your shopkeepers and your lawyers and your doctors, your and your small merchants and so forth, and school teachers. And so this all, it looks the same here across both the spectrums, across the northern spectrum and also the southern spectrum. And of course, remember that New England is heavily connected with England, with the mother country, through trade networks. The South's connected with England through the raw materials that goes to England. So both regions play a major role in the British Empire. And England also is going to find their best customers both north and south. They're going to sell a lot of goods to both sides here in this time period. Even though you have high taxes and high tariffs on these imported goods, on the British goods, you're going to see the American people still use the British system. They will still buy goods that way too. Okay? Now, the people of New England have more of a European folk tradition. They have their storytelling, and of course, a lot of it deals with knights and ladies and distress. They're going to be reading Shakespeare and Gulliver's Travels and things of this nature. You will see it in the South to a certain degree, but not to the degree the North has gotten it. The Northern people can read and write, and so therefore they're literary people, and they enjoy reading and enjoying the folk traditions that come out of Europe. A lot of your dance, a lot of your music in the North is very much British. I mean, look at the church music during the time period. A lot of your church music, and of course they were very religious in New England. A lot of your church music was European, had European roots. A lot of them sung the poems and the hymns of Martin Luther. A mighty fortress is our God was a major hymn that they sung here in this time period. And Martin Luther was the one who wrote that music here in this time period. Okay, and you also see folk dances. We see people coming in from Germany and from the Scandinavian countries, people coming in from Russia and Poland and Persia and places of those natures. The folk tradition comes with them, their folk dances and their festivals and their activities that are centered around their home country, their home culture they bring to North America. And of course, this all intermingles and comes together. Men in the North control society. You also have a certain extent of also having white supremacy up here. Okay, the Native Americans are the ones who are more affected in the North compared to the people who are enslaved in the South. And of course, they're going to find all kinds of interesting situations that take place between these folks and the Native Americans in this time period. Okay, the other group, of course, are the plain folks. They're the ones who do not do so well. They're about 40% of your people, 45% of your people in this time period. And these folks are the ones who are dock hands, they're day laborers. They look for odd jobs. They do not own land. They try to find a place to live by renting or by staying with somebody. Sometimes these folks get involved in such issues as artisan trade. They become apprentices. They become journeymen. They're trying to learn a trade. And if these people do learn a trade, then they're going to do quite well for themselves. Okay, they're going to do quite well for themselves if they do learn a trade during this time period. And they will reach middle class by doing so. So these young men who are part of this lower class here in the North, if they get into a situation that involves shipping and working on the docks and so forth, and they do a great job, they'll get hired. If they go and decide to join a gentleman who's a blacksmith or a cooper or a carpenter or a sawyer, and they become an apprentice and they become a journeyman, they'll eventually break away and have their own shop, and they'll do quite well for themselves. So you start seeing all this take place here in this colonial time period as you start seeing society change. The population grows extremely well during this time period. The population in this time period is going to expand and grow because America's got a better climate, they have better food, they have cleaner water than the Europeans have. And I mentioned this to you guys before. The average family in the colonial period will have 10 children. The average family will have around 10 children in the colonial period. It's not unusual to see a family of 14 or a family of 16 are a family of 20 people during this time period. I mentioned earlier about my grandparents who lived during this time period. My great-great-great-great-grandparents, my fifth greats, my sixth great grandparents. They get married and they have 12 children by one wife. She'll die in childbirth at age 45. And he's got all these little kids to take care of. And he'll get remarried pretty quickly to a younger woman usually, and will usually have another 12 kids before he dies at age 70 or 75. And I found a lot of this in my genealogy research. I found these Weathers that did have 14 children. They did have 20 children or 24 children. It's not uncommon for this to happen. When y'all do y'all's research, your genealogy research, you'll find the same thing in your families, where the man might be married 3 or 4 times. His wives keep dying on him, mainly through childbirth, and he has to find somebody to marry real quickly. He'll be in trouble. He has to have that support system going on with that wife. And so you have these families who have these large number of children. Okay, all right. We have natural fertility. We have natural fertility here in this society, and of course, population grows immensely. The American people are going to expand because of the number of children they have. Okay, so it's going to be interesting here of how this works. By the way, the average girl got married at age 15. The boy that got married was usually 21, because today they'd all go to jail. 21 for the boy, 15 for the girl. She had her first baby usually around 17. She had babies until either she passed away from having babies or until she reached menopause. And a lot of women were pregnant during menopause. You can imagine how crazy that household got here, and these women trying to have these babies, and their bodies are changing, and they just go pretty much crazy in a certain extent here in this time period. They start losing the sense of reality here in this time period. And a lot of women went through menopause while carrying a baby, and they had a hard time keeping stability while doing so here in this society. Okay? Now, the people of the North and the South are very much interested in becoming part of England. They said that we are the suppliers of England and we are the purchasers of England. And therefore, we should have the chance to have somebody from the Americas, somebody from the 13 American colonies that goes to London and is part of Parliament. The American people want a voice in the House of Commons. And England says no. And over again, they tell us, no, you cannot do that. They said that you are the people we got rid of, and so therefore you are not really British citizens. All right. The American people started discussing a new term called democracy. And here again, they were told that this would not work, that humans could not rule humans, that humans had to have a king or a pope or a queen ahead of them to make sure their society was growing, to make sure that society was productive, that individuals could not help rule a country, that it would not work. Democracy to the British people in this time period was anarchy. It'd be total anarchy. And those Europeans kind of laughed at the American people when they started discussing the ideology, the ideas behind democracy. They could not see it working here at all during this time period. Also, it's in this colonial time period that 80% of the raw materials, 80% of the items that go to England come from the American colonies. Remember that the American South produces 64% of the economy for England. So that leaves what, 24% that comes out of the North, or 20% that comes out of the North? And they have more people up north than they are in the South. So the people up north are not highly as involved with England as the American South is when it comes to raw materials. Also, the American people, both North and South, is going to produce 60% of the manufactured, or they're going to be the purchasers of 60% of all the finished goods that come from England. So the American people are going to purchase 60% of all the goods that England produces. So you see the role of colonies here. We are totally controlled by England. The American South, of course, is raw materials, cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, rice, hemp, those items. And the North is going to be mostly shipping the goods to England, getting the goods across the Atlantic Ocean. And remember also that the New England colonies played a major role in the African slave trade. They're not excused either, guys, when it comes to slavery. They're just as much involved in slavery as the American South is. And that's going to be true until the end African slavery in 1808. So you can't say that one group is better than another group. They're both in the same boat here, and literally in the same boat, because New England are the ones who are bringing the slaves from Africa to the American South. And the largest colony involved in the slave trade is going to be Rhode Island. Rhode Island is your major slaving colony in this time period. Oh, y'all think Virginia or North Carolina or Georgia? No, it's Rhode Island. They had more sea captains involved in the African slave trade than any other group in colonial America. As a matter of fact, when they became a state after the Constitution of 1787, they're the first state that enters the Union that outlaws slavery. They're the first ones in the country that outlaw slavery. And the rest of the northern states don't outlaw slavery until 1819. So they're 20, 25, 30 years ahead of everybody else when it comes to the issue of slavery. And it'd been nice if everybody had joined Rhode Island in the 1790s and outlawed slavery and been done with it. And we had some chances to do so, but people fought against it and they would not do it. And you'd have votes, and sometimes the votes were passed by one person to keep slavery intact. And so you're going to see this off and on here in our history here. Okay. Now, colonial Americans are heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment comes in after the Renaissance. The Enlightenment period begins generally toward the latter part of the 1500s. It involves a lot of people, including Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth, King James. A lot of your philosophers, they're part of this Enlightenment period. And I want to discuss these folks for a few minutes and give you an idea of the influence they had toward democracy. It just does not happen here. And by the way, your founding fathers, the ones who were born after 1700, these founding fathers are the ones who are highly involved in the ideologies and the philosophies and even the theologies of the Enlightenment period. Okay? We had the most educated bunch in America as founding fathers. I want you guys to remember this. And we had a lot of people who came to the table who actually developed democracy from the ideologies, the ideals of the Enlightenment. So y'all need to know a little bit about what's going on here. The Enlightenment group are the ones who look at natural laws. They realize the universe has laws. They have laws of gravity. They have laws of rotation. You have various laws that deals with the flow of water. You have ideology about storms and rain and lightning and all these items here. You're trying to look at the laws of the universe here in this time period. And a lot of these philosophers I'm going to mention here believe that God was a watchmaker, that God made the universe like a watchmaker makes a watch. And then God wound up the universe and released it. And it works on its own by natural laws. Just how the clockmaker winds up the watch and the watch keeps working as long as it has got tension from being wind up. And so they believe that God set the motion of the universe, that God's like a watchmaker, and the universe has laws that governs it, and these laws keeps it working perfectly. Okay, all right. It's also with this ideology of God being a watchmaker and the universe being controlled by natural laws that comes the scientific revolution. They start trying to find ways to explain science in a way that is standard, in a way that brings in understanding for lots of people. And they believe that men can control their destiny, that you're not predestined by God to heaven or hell, that you have actually control of your destiny, that you are the ones who picks yourselves up and finds good jobs to do and takes care of your family and builds a life that you like, a life that you think is suitable for you and your family. So man controls his destiny through the scientific revolution. God gives humans the power of reason. and they can overcome natural obstructions through their reasoning. So medical research, engineering, formation of government, it all becomes part of this, that you can work out here through reasoning ways to control your destiny. So these founding fathers are heavily involved in the laws of nature and the science revolution. They can apply to science. Why can't it apply to the political side? Why can't it apply to the religious side here in this time period? Okay, your first major philosopher in this time period is John Locke, L-O-C-K-E. John Locke says all mankind being equal and independent, that no one ought to harm another in his life, his health, his liberty, or his possessions. All right? No man's knowledge can go beyond his experience. That no man's knowledge can go beyond your experience. And he says, what worries you is your master. What worries you is your master. He also is going to say that all men are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, here's a little sideline. I probably mentioned in lecture number 2. John Locke was also part of the African slave trade. He did invest money into the African slave trade. So I'm thinking that he's saying that all white men are created equal with the rights to life, liberty, and property. So this white supremacy is still very much a part of what's going on here in this time period. Then here comes Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton changed the way we understand the universe. He discovered the laws of gravity and motion. All right, he invented calculus. So all you mathematicians, y'all should love Isaac Newton here. He helped to shape our natural worldview. And he told the people here in this time period, I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. I can explain the universe, but I can't explain why Bubba over here is half crazy and why he does what he does. I can't explain that. But I do know that the people I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not understand how people react and how they live their lives. Then here comes Galileo. Galileo is an Italian scientist. He's also watching the stars. He starts observing the movements of the heavens in this time period. Okay? He said all truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them. Do not feel obliged or believe that the same God who endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended to forego their uses, to make sure that God is part of the universe, to keep him in mind here. Well, you know, Galileo was a devout Catholic. And he made the announcement that the earth is not the center of the universe. The Catholic Church believed the earth was the center of the universe. Well, guys, what happens here is that he totally forgoes what the Catholic Church has been teaching. He says the sun is the center of our universe, that our world and all these planets revolve around the sun. And they didn't like it. And he got excommunicated for being a heretic here in this time period. So the church is still trying to influence science here in this time period. I looked at today's world, religion still tries to influence medical research in this time period. Look at this use of stem cells and so forth in research, and how the church and how the religious people fought this. They didn't want us using that. Back at the time of Sigmund Freud in 1900 and 1910 and the 1920s, they said Sigmund Freud is doing God's work, that God creates insanity. Insanity comes from sin. You can't study the mind, that's God's business. So you start seeing this all still being evolved here as people try to not let change take place, to try to make change not a reality for a lot of people here. And then comes my favorite inventor of all of these folks, and that's Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was a leading author. He was a printer. He's a political theorist, a politician, a Freemason. Okay, he's a postmaster, he's a scientist, inventor, a civic activist, a statesman, and a diplomat. And he told the people, tell me and I will forget. Tell me and I will forget. Teach me and I may remember. All right. And then he says, involve me and I will learn. Involve me, I will learn. Okay? And he says, by failing to prepare is going to lead you to failure. If you do not prepare, you're destined for failure. And of course, he's a gentleman who started playing with electricity. He saw that little electric spark that comes off the end of your finger during cold weather, and it shocks somebody. And he says, is this the same thing I see in the clouds when a thunderstorm comes through? And he invented a little device on a wheel. He put some cloth over it, and he turned it, and he made second electricity, and he would touch it and put a spark off. He's the one who invented what is called the battery. Negative, positive, all this stuff was all invented by Mr. Ben Franklin. And then he decided to test it out by flying a kite in a rainstorm. Now, he is in his late 40s doing this, guys. And don't think that his son William was a little kid. He was 23 years old. He's older than most of you guys are. And this young man and his father went out to the rainstorm, and they proved that electricity is the same from the static spark of the small side to the large size of lightning. And then Ben Franklin said something I want you guys to realize. This is very interesting information here. Ben Franklin says, can the little become the large? Can the little spark become the large? Can individuals coming together in their communities to form a democratic church and a democratic society, can that become a large for a national government? Can the small become the large? And he realized it could. So in his teachings, he told the American people that democracy can work because it's like electricity. It can be small and evolves through your churches, it evolves through your families, it evolves through your communities. And all of a sudden, we're coming together for the large, the United States of America. Okay? So Ben Franklin's a pretty important fellow during this time period, and he made lots of inventions. You know that Ben Franklin retired from working, making a living, making a salary at age 42. He told the people at age 42, I'm wealthy, I don't need any more money. I don't need any more money, and I am not going to take money from anybody from anymore. I'm going to help humans. I'm going to help mankind. And by inventing that lightning, by inventing that or understanding electricity, he invents what is called the lightning rod. And the lightning rod started saving your cities from major fires through thunderstorms. In all your large buildings, all your larger areas in across the country, mainly New York and Boston, they put up lightning rods. And the town did not have sections that burned anymore because of lightning. London and Paris and Berlin and all these European cities are also going to use the lightning rod of Ben Franklin. And these lightning rods make Ben Franklin a very famous person. When he goes to Europe, and he goes over several times to Europe, particularly when he goes to Paris in 1776 to get the French to join the revolution. The people of Paris, the people of Europe, saw him as being a national hero. And they had Ben Franklin ashtrays and Ben Franklin trinkets of all different kinds. And they had T-shirts. They'd been a Ben Franklin T-shirt during this time period. And he was a well-known celebrity. He's like a rock star here, guys, when he goes to Europe. So these folks here, these inventors are very important. Then you have John Hobbes. John Hobbes is a philosopher, and he says that the state of war is a way of life that tries to prove people's inhumanity. Things like being nasty and being brutish, being short-tempered, this sort of thing. And he says that human nature is amplified through animal knowledge, animal nature. Let's leave our basic desires of greed and hate and fighting and war behind and come together and help each other with regards to each other. So you start seeing John Hobbes. And then, of course, you have Francis Bacon. Do y'all know that Francis Bacon worked with Queen Elizabeth? That he was a lawyer, a member of Parliament. He was on the Queen's Council. All right. He wrote about the questions of law and state and religion. Okay. He also was interested in contemporary politics. So Francis Bacon is one of your leading figures in natural philosophy, and he plays a major role in the time of Elizabeth and King James I. And his influences also are going to come to the founding fathers. All right, and then you have Adam Smith. Now he's a little bit later on. Adam Smith wrote his big book in 1776, and his book is called The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations. All right. He's a Scottish moral philosopher. He's also a pioneer of the modern economy. He also looks at a political economy. All right. And he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And he wrote that as people begin to industrialize and small groups of people become the owners of large businesses and large industries, and they start attaining great wealth, they're going to get greedy. The more they make, the more they want. And they're going to put restrictions on their laborers and put wage controls on them and try to make as much money as they possibly can. And he's supposed to be wealthy. He's supposed to be weary of the wealthy class, because at one time they will control everything. They'll control the money supply. They'll control the economy. They'll control the politics. They'll control all of it. And he said to be weary of the wealthy class, because they will become greedy and try to control everything. Okay? So you'll remember Mr. Adam Smith here. Okay? Now, I want you guys to realize also that your founding fathers, a lot of them were educated. Some of these guys had gone to Harvard. They had gone to William and Mary. William and Mary was created in the early 1690s. They were well-read people here. By the 1740s, you're going to have universities like Brown and Rutgers and other universities being developed. Columbia University is developed during this time period. And you're going to see these men who actually go here. You know, Alexander Hamilton had left the Caribbean as a young man, about 18 years old, moved to New York City, went to Columbia. And he's one of your major founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson attended William and Mary here in Virginia. He is also the creator of the University of Virginia. That was founded around 1812 time period. One of the most proudest moments of his career is the building of William and Mary. The building of the University of Virginia. He was very proud of his college here. So a lot of these men are going to be well-educated, well-read people of the time period. I'm going to look at Ben Franklin. He didn't go to college that I know of, but he's a man who brought in the library system. And he brought in the public library so people could obtain books for free and can educate themselves. I know a lot of young people that are my age. When they were young people, they're now my age. When they were young, they couldn't afford anything. They didn't have anything. They barely had food on the table in their homes. But they discovered the library. They went to that library and they checked out books. And they went from those pre-K books, those little children's books, all the way up to the classics. And they read the history books, and they read the books of philosophy and of science. And by the time they were 18 years old, they were applying to go to schools that gave them free tuition because of their abilities and their knowledge. And they went to places like Harvard and the University of North Carolina and the University of Georgia. And they went to Florida State, and they went to Ole Miss, and they went to LSU. They went to the University of Texas, because they had trained themselves through actually using that library to build their future, and it worked for them. And there's quite a few of them that have done this, guys. So Ben Franklin went a long way to help kids when he brought in the library system. That's why in my library here in Valparaiso, I try to make sure that I have items, modern items, leading edge technology items for all the kids and for the adults, because I want you to keep learning. If you don't learn, if you don't keep up your education your entire life, you're going to get stagnated. All right? You need something to look forward to each day. Having something to look forward to each day keeps you young. If you keep up with technology, you stay young. And Ben Franklin knew this. And so by building these libraries and bringing the library systems into existence during this time period, Ben Franklin is going to help the American people with their democracy. Because these founding fathers realized educated people are your best voters. Educated people are your best politicians. Educated people are the ones who make a big imprint on the lives of others around them. Okay? When you do your family history, I want you to find the first person who went to college and what an influence they made on their families. My dad came back from World War II with a GI Bill and went to college. He's the oldest of 8 children. And of those 8 children, he got 4 of those kids through college. He told them, don't stay up here in Neshoba County, Mississippi, and just be farmers and live a simple backwoods life. Go down to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Go to Mississippi College in Clinton. Go to Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and get your degree here and become somebody. I got an aunt who's 90 years old, and she told us recently, she says, I am so grateful for your dad because he pulled me out in Neshoba County where I thought I'd marry an old boy up there and never had a good life. Because your mom and dad, I went off to Hattiesburg to college in Southern Mississippi, got a degree in culinary science, started working in large colleges as a dietitian, and here, of course, she met her husband, who's a professor, and they had a great life together. So it's important you look at all this stuff here that's going on when it comes to education. All right. Here in America, you start seeing tutors. You started seeing homeschooling going on. In the colonies of New England, where Massachusetts began all this stuff, you start seeing free public schools. The kids are actually going to school up here in this time period. You also have ministers who teach school. In your lecture notes, I got a big section that deals with Alexander McGilvray of the Creek Indians. His mother was Sahoy II. His father was from Scotland. McGilvray came over from Scotland, married Sahoy II, and produced Alexander McGilvray. When he turned 8 years old, Alexander left the Indian areas of Fort Toulouse, and he went to Charleston, South Carolina. His dad, Lachlan, had a large merchant house in Augusta, and he wanted his boy to be trained in both worlds. He wanted his boy to understand both worlds. And so he took Alexander to Charleston and hired a Presbyterian minister to teach him, to educate him. And Alexander McGilvray became a well-versed scholar during this time period. He loved math. He loved science. He learned how to speak French and Italian. He also knew how to speak English, of course. And he excelled at all this stuff. When the Revolutionary War broke out, he's going to be a loyalist fighting for England. A lot of you Southerners were loyalists in this war because England wrote the paycheck. They weren't too sure about these patriots. They say these patriots might get them all killed. So McGilvray is going to be on the losing side of the war, and he's forced back to the Creek Indian Nation in Alabama, where in the mid-1780s, he becomes the chief of the Creek Indians. And he's going to meet with George Washington in 1790 in New York City for a treaty. All right. And I wrote all that stuff up for you there in those lecture notes. And y'all read about McGilvray and all his entourage that went up to New York City during this time period. All right. And he used his knowledge to try to better his Indian nation, the Creeks, hoping that one day that they would fit right into society with no problem. Okay, that was his dream, to make them all blend together as one group here. So it's very important, guys, you remember how the importance of education here to the American people, not so much for the South as it is for the North. In the South, in the large homes, the wealthier homes, you did have tutors. They might hire a school teacher to come in and stay there all the time, teach the girls, teach the boys, and so forth. Your universities that are started during this colonial period will be Harvard, Brown, Columbia, or I mentioned those, Princeton, Yale, William and Mary. And it won't be long until the late 1700s that you're going to see the University of Georgia, you're going to see North Carolina, University of North Carolina. You're going to start seeing these other schools evolve and develop. University of Pennsylvania, you know, Ben Franklin had a hand in all of that. And so you're going to start seeing all of this evolve here and reach out to different people. Another important endeavor for the American people was books. If you had somebody in the house who could read, you were entertained by them reading you a book. Yeah, your audio books, your Bluetooth books, was a person in the family who could read. And ever so often across the South, here come a book peddler On a truck wagon, they would put a canvas, an oil canvas top on the top of the wagon. It'd be rolled over in a half moon shape. The back of the wagon was secure. They put some steps that folded down on the back side of the wagon. And they put bookcases with doors on them around the sides of the wagon. And then they put bookcases down the middle of the wagon. They put showcases down the middle of the wagon. And this man would go from farm to farm, from plantation to plantation, and he traded chickens and eggs and other items in a barter system for those books. And so on the plantation, these people, and in the yeoman South, even the yeoman North, they started having these book salesmen who went through delivering books, these book peddlers. So your first Amazon came to your house, guys. They're trying to do that now. You buy a package from Amazon, they're on your doorstep by the afternoon. And they're trying to find to do this. That book salesman comes through, you shop his book collection, and you have your order. You go right to the house with those books and you start reading them. And it's very important here. A lot of the books that were sold here, the most popular book sold, of course, was the Bible. They probably had a whole ton of Bibles on these truck wagons because they knew every family wanted a Bible of some kind. And by the way, these early Bibles printed here in America, they were big Bibles. They're big, as big as this laptop here is. They're pretty good sized Bibles, and they're about, that thick. They were like, 15, 20-pound Bibles. And in the middle of the Bibles, they had your genealogy. And a lot of your families kept their records from the middle of their Bibles. They knew who your great-grandpa was, your great-grandma was. They knew about their family, their brothers and sisters, their parents. Then it comes down to your grandparents and then their children and then your family and so forth. And these Bibles were great sources for genealogy because you knew who they belonged to. You knew how the family evolved. And some of you guys probably can find these old Bibles. I mean, but the ones from the 1800s are still around. If you find an old Bible, y'all be real gentle with it. Y'all put some white cotton gloves on and be real gentle with that Bible. And y'all look through it, and you're gonna find all kinds of little notes written inside those Bibles. You're gonna find little letters put in those Bibles. You're gonna find people who've written on the side of the pages in these Bibles. There's a lot of interesting information. There's a lot of history in your family Bibles. And you guys realize this, and y'all look for your family Bibles, and y'all use them for your genealogy purposes here. Okay, who are your great authors of the time period? Well, the best-selling author of all times, your John Grisham of the Colonial period, is going to be William Shakespeare. They love the plays of Shakespeare. He's an English poet, playwright. He's an actor. He is widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language. Okay. And of course, he brings in his big, huge Shakespearean theaters, putting on these plays, a place to go to, a place to look forward to each day, to go to the theater, or each month to go to the new play that's being opening at the Shakespearean Theater in downtown London. And people did this stuff here. Our people who went to England in this time period, the ones who were visitors, who were tourists, usually the wealthier class, they would go to these plays. And oftentimes, these wealthier folks would go to England for one reason, to put their son in school at Oxford or Cambridge, or put him in school at St. Andrew's Academy in Edinburgh, Scotland. So, guys, schooling and reading became very important here to these people. Okay? So you remember Shakespeare. Then you have John Milton. John Milton's an English poet. Okay? He's a man of letters. He's also a civil servant, if I can pronounce it, a civil servant who worked under Oliver Cromwell after the beheading of King Charles I. So John Milton also played a role in the British court, the British political system of the time period. And of course, he's well known for his book that is called Paradise Lost. And he told the people, "Give me liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely among the conscious." Okay? And he says that this gives you more liberties than any other source. The power to actually have liberty, to understand philosophy, to argue freely over various points. and to have full freedom, to have full liberty. That's John Milton. Jonathan Swift, all right? He's an Anglican Irish author. He's a satirist. He's an essayist. He's a political writer of the time period. He's also a poet, okay? He also became the dean at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, okay? And Jonathan Swift is known for his book called Gulliver's Travels, all right? And he says we have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another. We have enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another. Does that apply to today's world? Yes, it does, in a lot of ways here. Okay, then you had Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather lived in New England, and he is a biography. And he wrote the early history of the colonial Americans. And he's one of the ones who said the hand of God came across the land and prepared the place for the Englishmen. He gave God the glory. He gave God the inspiration to clear the land for the British, not knowing the true reason the land was cleared was old world diseases. It was smallpox that cleared the land, not the hand of God. Then you had Anne Bradstreet. She also lived in colonial America. She lives in the North, and she's the first woman, the first American woman who published a book of poetry. Okay, she's the first woman in America to publish a book of poetry, and that's Anne Bradstreet. Okay, when it came to music, we are in the Baroque period. I love Baroque music, and I think you guys would if you listen to it. Listen to J.S. Bach. Listen to Handel. Mozart. Mozart's toward the end of all of this, but his work is just absolutely fantastic, guys, to listen to. And his operas and his arias and all the things that he produced here. It's amazing here. Some nights I had nothing to watch on television. I'll go to YouTube and I'll find these composers' music being played by different orchestras and put that on and watch that as listen to that as I'm studying or working on the internet or whatever. And it just gives you a lot of solace. It gives you a lot of peace to your life by listening to this classical music. It's also during this time that ballet and opera is evolving. The opera is going to come out of the courts of Italy. The rulers of Italy are the ones who bring in operas, and they use operas to impress their visitors. When a person from another kingdom or another country comes to visit, they have an opera set up for the visitor. And you guys should be listening to some opera and watching some opera from time to time. You're going to say, oh, it's boring. But if you get into it, it's not. You got to give it a chance. You got to give it at least 15 minutes. All right? That won't hurt you for 15 minutes to listen to a little bit of opera. And you might enjoy it. You might find things I love Mozart's operas, and I do listen to them. Don Genevote, all of his great works that he did, the Magic Flute and Don Genevote and all that stuff. There's some great stuff here, guys, that you listen to. The ballet came out of the French courts. The French kings are the ones who developed the ballet. And they used ballet to help them entertain their visitors from around Europe and from various parts of the world who come to Paris to visit them. Okay? And both ballet and opera are used to tell a story. They have plots and subplots here. Of course, they use lots of artwork in these agendas. The ballet does have elaborate sets. So does your opera here. When it comes to art during this time period, the two men that I really look at for art during this period of time are Rembrandt and Peter Paul Rubens. And there's hundreds of them that are doing artwork during this time period. But these artists are an example here of how the world's people are seeing themselves. And y'all need to go to some art museums. I want to tell you guys, y'all have got one in Montgomery that is absolutely fantastic. Whenever I go to the Montgomery Art Museum, and I usually go about every 3 or 4 years, I try to go to Montgomery every 3 or 4 years to go to their museums, see how they improved and what they've done to their museums. They got some great ones up there. Their art museum is fabulous. I'll spend 4 or 5 hours in that art museum. And you're allowed to, you can buy prints of artwork up there. I love Southern folk art. That's what I have behind me is a lot of this Southern folk art type stuff that's used in advertising. And I collect all this stuff. And there has some amazing artists up here in Montgomery. So y'all think about going up there and seeing that, going to the art museum. When it comes to other museums, they have the natural history museums. All right. They have natural history and they have national history museums. Some of you guys need to go to Tallahassee if y'all going to visit Florida State. The state archives are in the Gray building. It's right behind the state capitol. There's the state capitol and the Supreme Court building. And then there's the Gray building, which is the state library and the archives. And then Florida State starts right behind it. The law school is right behind the library here in downtown Tallahassee. And in the basement is the Florida Natural History Museum. And you can go in there and see that woolly mammoth that they took out of Wakulla Springs, and it's totally assembled. You can go in there and see the Spanish coins that have been discovered from the shipwrecks. They have a complete orange grove plantation that's in there. It shows how they went through and processed oranges and all this stuff. There's Native American history in here. It's a pretty good museum for a state museum here. Go to Montgomery, go to Mobile, go to New Orleans, go to Jackson. Go to Atlanta, go to Columbia, South Carolina, go to Nashville, Tennessee. And while you're traveling, hit these museums. You know, they're more fun than Disney World is. They don't charge you $10 for a Coke. All right? It's interesting. And these museums are just totally impressive. And you learn items you did not know. If you have little children, introduce them to museums. Let them start learning by seeing, by experiencing what's going on here. Okay? Now, guys, the next part of the lecture is going to deal with religion. During this colonial period, the late colonial period, we have what is called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is going to happen because of new theology that's being promoted around Europe. The new theology says that you are not predestined to heaven or hell, that you have free choice. They use John 3:16. Whoever believes shall be saved. I want you guys to look at that word, whoever. That is totally inclusive. Nobody is left out. It's for everybody. It is saying that everybody has a right to church regardless of their background. Okay? That you have no rights to leave people out of the church because the church is totally inclusive for all people. And of course, these churches today, they have a lot of white supremacy in there. They don't want to have homosexuals in their churches. They don't want black members in their churches. They want people who came from Southeast Asia to be converted and become Christians. They don't want people from the Muslim world coming to their churches. They want to be a closed society. And these folks says you're not a closed society, that you have got to be totally open and be inclusive for everybody. In today's world, we're trying to promote to be having everybody inclusive, having nobody left out, to make sure that we take care of all the people regardless of their backgrounds. Okay? The major theologian of this time period is a man whose name is Jacob Arminius. That's spelled Arminus. Jacob Arminius is Dutch. He's from Holland. And he says we have grace through salvation from our personal beliefs. And he used John 3:16 as his text. John 3:16 is what's being used here, guys, to explain the new theology. Okay? You start having what is called predestination versus Arminianism. Arminianism versus predestination. Okay? And Arminianism is going to win out. The old rules, the old John Calvin theology of the 1530s and 1540s about being predestined are going away in the 1730s, 1740s, 1760s. Okay? We have some major preachers who came out of this. Out of England came George Whitefield. George Whitefield is going to come to America. He's going to preach in Philadelphia during this awakening period. And Ben Franklin heard him preach. They said that his voice was so melodic and so forceful that a congregation of 30,000 people could hear him preach. And his voice was so emotional that people broke down crying listening to his sermons. He made them personal. Okay? Also from England comes a friend of James Oglethorpe. His name is going to be John Wesley. John Wesley is the father of the Methodist Church. And John Wesley is going to come to Georgia several times, and he's going to preach up and down the East Coast of the colonies here during this awakening period. And he is going to have established his church here in North America, which is going to be the Methodist Church. Remember, Roger Williams started the Baptist Church, okay? Roger Williams was the father of the Baptist Church, okay? The Presbyterian Church is already here. It came over to Jamestown as early as 1619. But this church is going to see a great growth takes place during this awakening time period. So your three major churches that come out of the awakening will be your Presbyterians, your Methodist, and your Baptist, okay? The Presbyterians were mostly for the upper class and the upper middle class. The Methodists were for your middle class. And the Baptists were for your lower class people. A lot of my friends always told me the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist is a Methodist could read. I don't know how true that is, but it's interesting to think about all that stuff. Okay? So guys, you had the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the Baptist Church that were formulated during this Great Awakening time period. They're going to get big and strong during this time period. Okay? One of the greatest American preachers, of course, was Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is going to preach in Massachusetts, and he's not going to really worry about the old folks. He says, I want the new folks. I want the young folks. And he started having big revival meetings in fields on Saturday afternoons and on Sunday afternoons. And sometimes as many as 20,000 young people would show up for his revival meetings. And he was well known for his revivals in this time period. So don't forget about Jonathan Edwards. He also had elaborate sermons. One of his famous sermons, he talked about a spider being hung by a web over the fires of hell and how the spider could retreat and get to safety again if he is saved. Did all kinds of stuff. He preached about the horrors of hell and the beauty of heaven. He painted a landscape through his storytelling, through his sermons for these kids to see. And these kids got turned on to it. They got excited about it. They spoke in tongues. They had the rolling fits down the aisles here. And sometimes they got turned on sexually. They said sometime at the revival meeting, you had more new births than you had rebirths. These boys would carry those girls out in the woods and they would baptize them after these big, huge revival meetings. They got turned on sexually. That's true that when you go to a concert, if you go out to the club somewhere, and these kids try to hook up with each other, same thing going on today. It's just in a different atmosphere, okay? Because they had nothing else to look forward to during this time period. Those kids went to revival meetings to have a good time, to see what's going on. And they brought their picnic lunches, and they went as groups, and they had a good time out here at these revival meetings on the weekends. And Mr. Edwards was a major part of this here in this time period. You also had William Tennant. The Tennant family are going to be associated with Presbyterians. And they're the ones who builds a college to teach Presbyterian ministers how to preach. And the college is called the College of New Jersey. And this college will turn into Princeton University. So you'll have William Tennant and his group who are going to be responsible for building the College of Learning for the Presbyterians. By the way, the Baptist College, the Baptist University of this time period is going to be Brown University. Brown is well known as a Baptist school. Probably the best known Methodist school that I know of around is going to be Duke University. But Duke does not come until the later 1800s. It's going to be a while before Duke shows up. But they got a wonderful school at Duke, and of course they are more Methodist oriented than they are from any other religion here in this time period. Okay? So guys, here comes the Great Awakening in the 1730s. The Great Awakening goes across the country just like a firestorm would. It's going to burn up the countryside. People become religious. Church comes to the American South. Southern people are going to allow the white families to attend church along with the black families, the Native American families. Anybody in your community can go to the church here in this time period. Now, most of these early churches that were built here in this time period, the white folks would sit downstairs. The white folks sit on the main level of the building. And they put up high benches with high sides on the benches so you could not look around. You walk in, you see this pretty little sweet thing sitting over there, and you want to see what he or she looks like, and you want to kind of peep around. You can't see them because those pews are so high. And the preacher was in the air. They had the pulpit up on a podium up there, or up on a deck up there, and all you had to do, you had to look up at him all the time, and you couldn't look around. You was focused on that preacher. Upstairs in the balcony is where all the slave people, the free blacks, the Creoles, Native Americans, and other folks would sit. They would sit in the balcony areas up here. So the church were together, but yet the church was segregated. Okay, they were together, but yet they were segregated. Okay, well, guys, churches began to evolve. You know, the Methodists and the Baptists were really interested in trying to get churches in the frontier areas established as quickly as possible through the Great Awakening. And they hired young men, like 20, 25, 30-year-old men. And these young guys would get on horseback and go from place to place to preach. They would go from place to place to preach, trying to spread salvation. Okay, they call them circuit riders. And they might have a circuit that's a month long. And every Sunday they're in a different location for a sermon. On Wednesday nights, they do a prayer meeting in a different location. And they'll have just those scratched up sermons on front of porches and other places from time to time. And these men really promoted the gospel here across the South and across New England, across the middle colonies during this time period. Okay, these men, these circuit riders, begin to preach here, and they'd go from place to place. These young men had a hook to their work. Most of these young men were pretty good looking. They were well built. They had their abs still showing. And these young girls, they loved these circuit riders. They were groupies already. And these girls, we talk about the circuit riders who come through town, the one they liked the best and so forth. These men, these circuit riders knew if we get the women in attendance, and they did pretty quickly once they saw them, new blood in town, if the girls would come, the boys would come right behind them. You built your congregation by getting the women to your church services, and the men would show up. Mainly trying to protect their girlfriends from that preacher up there. And by the way, there was a lot of these circuit riders who were guilty of producing lots of babies as they went around the countryside preaching. A lot of these families would invite the preacher into their household to sleep and eat with them, take care of him for the evening. And after midnight, he took care of himself. If you had 3 or 4 daughters, he took turns with 3 or 4 daughters in your household. And 9 months later, you had a bunch of Baptist preacher kids being born here in the households. And of course, the old man would be mad as the devil because that preacher got his daughters in trouble. Well, you think that's new? Look at old Jerry Falwell Jr., guys. Look at Tammy Faye and Jim Baker back in the 1980s. Look at Jimmy Swaggart in the 1980s. It's crazy that these preachers cannot behave themselves, and they do all kinds of stupid stuff. It's going on here, guys, in the colonial period. Well, these preachers do start seeding out various kinds of church denominations or various kinds of memberships in their churches. And all of a sudden, you'll have 10 or 15 families that want to come together and form a new church. Okay? The first ordeal here is to define citizenship. To define citizenship. Who is a citizen of that church? And of course, they're going to say they have to be baptized, be saved and baptized, and are a member of the church. Okay? They also says that the membership is inclusive, particularly the Baptist church, that is inclusive, that anybody who believes and is saved can join their church. So you had black members, you had white members, you had Creole members, and so forth. Okay? And these members have the right to vote. They do have some civil liberties in church. Okay? The right to assemble. All right? The right to go through and print sermons. They have the right to do various things here. That's good. You're going to start seeing in our Constitution. So the church becomes very influential toward democracy in the 1730s and 1740s, 1760s. Okay? And as Ben Franklin said, can the small become the big? All right? Well, once you go to identify your church members, you have them vote on writing a church constitution, writing the laws that governs the church. The Constitution comes right behind membership. Who's a citizen? And they sat down and they wrote a Constitution. The Constitution involved deacons and elders. They decided that you should have like 6 to 12 deacons, depending on how big your church is. And your deacon should oversee at least a handful of your members of your church. You have like 6 deacons, you got 100 people in there. You got 100 families, I should say, in there. They're going to oversee probably about 18 families. They represent those people in church. When it comes to making new rules and regulations and so forth, they look at their congregation and what they want. These are going to become representatives. For every 35,000 people in the United States, in one county or one area, you have got a member of the House of Representatives. So guys, these deacons is going to equate to the House of Representatives. It's going to equate to the Senate to a certain extent, or to Congress, if you will, to a certain extent. Okay? Then they discuss the preacher, his theology, his beliefs. Does he agree with what your church agrees with, and so forth? And you'll have an election for the members or for the people who become your ministers. And you'll have them come to your church. You might have 4 or 5 men who want to apply to be your minister. They come to your church, one each Sunday for a month, and they preach. After they have all preached, the congregation gets together and they have a vote. A closed ballot vote. And you write down the name of the person that you like best as being your minister. And after they take the vote, they go through and count the vote up. If there's a close, if there's only maybe 1 or 2 votes between the gentlemen, or they tied up, they'll invite them back the 5th Sunday for a preach-off. Have one preach, have the other preach. Okay? Now, part of the ritual of all this stuff is that when you have a calling opening for a pastor and they come to preach, that after church you have a big, huge dinner. It is called Dinner on the Grounds. And they would run 2x4s and 1x12s between the trees to make tables out of. You had these running tables through the trees, and they were all shaped of all various sizes and various shapes out here because how the trees were planted out here in the courtyard of the church. And everybody would bring their bench or bring their chair and maybe bring a card table or a folding table of some kind. And of course, the ladies made all kinds of food here for dinners on the ground. I miss this. When I was a kid, we had them regularly. And all these ladies would bring up their dishes that they would prepare. And you had some wonderful food to choose from. You had some that was not so hot, but most of the food was really good. Really good desserts here in this time period. And so they would have dinner on the ground. And of course, gave people a chance to discuss the man they had listened to that morning. And also gives the man who preached that morning a chance to meet the people. Get to know the people of that church, hoping that they'll call him to be their minister. So you have open, free elections, closed elections, secret ballots, in which the people voted. Now, I want to tell you another thing. They did this also for the deacons and for the elders. They voted on these men. You might have maybe 10 men who volunteer to become elders of your church or deacons of your church. You only need 6. And you'll have a vote one Sunday on the deacons. And they'll count the vote, and the top 6 are the ones that become the deacons. So there's a tie at number 6 or number 5. There's 2 or 3 people tied up. They'll take another vote over those 3 people to decide who should become the new deacon. So it's all done through free elections here, guys. So here you're going to start seeing a judicial branch of church. They do have church courts. If anybody sins or commits adultery or any other problems here, if anybody's involved in a fight or murder or whatever, they will throw them out of church. You'll have church court who will throw them out of church and tell them they can come back later once they repented themselves of their sin. Okay? So you'll have the judicial areas, you'll have the legislative areas, and you'll have the executive area with your preacher. And here comes democracy to your churches. Okay? Democracy is test bedded in your churches. So if I should ask you, give me 5 things that the church involved in democracy. They define membership, wrote a constitution, selected the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. That's your 5 things that the church brought in here to this time period. Okay? So guys, the church is very important here when it comes to democracy. Am I telling you we're a Christian nation? No, I'm not. I can never claim that we ever were a Christian nation. With slavery and violence and protest and people being left out and people trying to get into the system and white supremacy and racism, no. But the church did evolve our democracy. We realize that our democracy will work. And people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, all these people, they're the ones who are going to be around here, guys, when all this takes place. John Hancock, John Adams, Samuel Adams, all these folks are around here, James Monroe. There's lots of folks here, guys, who saw democracy in action and realized that democracy will work. They saw it at the church level. And so the founding fathers stepped off in faith, believing that this new government could work out here, become part of a new nation, that we do not need a king or a pope or a queen to rule us, that we can rule ourselves. So guys, the church plays a major important role in the scheme of democracy. And don't you guys forget this. The church played an important role in this. Even though we're not a Christian nation, we're trying to strive in certain areas to better ourselves. And Christianity does give you the option to try to improve your lives and improve your existence, but so does all the world religions. They all play a role in making people civil to one another and to love one another, to take care of one another. And that's what's important here, to give people opportunities to experience the same lifestyle that you have and the same degree of success and being happy and being motivated in our society and becoming good voters and good citizens here. Okay? And from the Great Awakening and from the Enlightenment period, you have the evolution of democracy in America. So if you guys want to do a good study sometime, y'all just study the families, the founding fathers, and what they were up to. And there's some great books out there by various historians who've written about the founding fathers and how they evolved democracy. Okay? Now, one group who feels left out and is trying to find a way in are the Native Americans. A lot of colonial people believe that Native Americans do not have souls. If a person is deemed soulless, what can you do to them? You're putting them in the category of animals. And I've come to the conclusion that animals got souls. I got 3 puppies in here aggravate me right now. And these 3 puppies all got souls. All 3 are different, and they all 3 love me in a different way. And they have different personalities. You got one here whining right now when we give him a dog biscuit. You have your animals that I do believe have souls, that you will see them in a future life, that they will be together again. Okay, so you have the people who say they're not soul, they do not have souls, and so therefore you can destroy them because they don't have souls. A lot of your white planters believe their African people did not have souls. They carried them to church hoping they might have a soul. Isn't that crazy? The mentality of these people here in this time period. Okay, so the Native Americans are trying to find a way to survive, trying to find a way to fit in here in this time period. And I look at the Creek Indian Nation again. I look at the Sahoys of the Wind Clan of the Creeks. Sahoy the first had married Merchant, a Frenchman out of Mobile, and she produced a daughter named Sahoy the second. Sahoy the second was part French and part Creek. She's half and half. She has a lineage from both sides. And so Sahoy the second becomes the new epitome of a new American that they have blended, trying to keep their civilization going as the conquerors come in, because they could be left out. Okay? Sahoy the second is born around 1723 time period, and she grows up there at Fort Toulouse area of Alabama, where the Wind Clan was located. In 1719, over in Scotland, a young boy is born. His name is Lachlan McGilvery. McGilvery turns 16, and he's recruited. By the way, 16, you're an adult, and he's recruited to come to Georgia as a soldier. George Dunbar had gone to Scotland to round up people to come to Georgia to increase the population here in Georgia. And this young kid comes to Georgia as a soldier. He serves about 7 years in the military. He gets out. He goes up to Augusta, Georgia, and joins some large trading houses. They trade whitetail deer skin. Okay? Lachlan is going to make his way into Alabama. And when he gets here in the early 1740s, he's going to meet a young girl whose name is Ahoy II. She had just lost her husband. Her husband had died, and yet that did not upset him, and he married her. And they produced a son named Alexander McGilvery. Okay? Alexander will make his way to become the chieftain of the Creek Indian Nation, who's going to meet George Washington. All right? McGilvery is going to marry her, but she's already got a daughter. The daughter had come out of a marriage with a gentleman, and she produced, her name is Ahoy III. So Ahoy III is not the daughter of McGilvery, but Alexander is the half-brother of Ahoy III. And Ahoy III is going to marry a Georgian who's also a deerskin trader out of Augusta, whose name is Charles Weatherford. And they'll produce a son whose name is William Weatherford. And he becomes the leader of the Creek Indians during the Creek Indian War of 1811 to 1814 time period. So you see, they're trying to intermingle. They're trying to look American. And by the way, William Weatherford was only about 1/4 Native American, if that much. And he appeared to be a white man. He did have red hair. He was dark complected. He had red hair, and he had very dark blue eye, very dark brown eyes. So he had that mixture of the Scottish and the Indian in his lineage. And of course, McGilvery is going to have that big trading house, and he makes sure that his son Alexander is well educated. Okay, Ahoy III, her husband Charles Weatherford was not that well educated, and of course their son William was not educated at all. But I'm going to tell you a little story here about this bunch. It's very interesting here. Okay, what transpires here is that during the war, Revolutionary War, McGilvery, Lachlan, did not become a patriot. He stayed a loyalist. And when the war ended, he was deported. He was sent back to Scotland. Okay? When McGilvery Alexander comes back home from New York City in 1790, his wife had died. They had 3 little girls and a little boy. Well, a few months later, Alexander goes down to Pensacola to visit with Patton and Leslie, a large trading post here in Pensacola. And while down here in the house of William Patton, he died, which left these 4 children with no parents. So Ahoy III decided to adopt them. So Ahoy Weatherford brought the little girls to her house. But the little boy was just too hard to handle. And they figured the best solution for Alexander Jr. was to ship him off to Scotland to his grandpa. Well, Ahoy Weatherford had been married earlier to a British soldier who had died, but she had a son named David. And David Tate, her oldest son, is going to escort Alexander Jr. down to Pensacola to Patton and Leslie to go to live with Lachlan McGilvery in Scotland. Now you got to get down. I can't talk if you don't talk with me. All right, guys. They carry those 2 boys. Patton and Leslie carries those 2 boys, David Tate and Alexander McGilvery Jr., to the Bahamas. And in the Bahamas lives a loyalist father of Charles Weatherford. All right, Charles had gone back to Alabama. He fled all this stuff, but his father Martin did not sign a loyalty oath. He was still a loyalist, and he got deported to the Bahamas here after the Revolutionary War. And here in the Bahamas, Martin Weatherford has a young son named Richard, who's about 15 years old, 16 years old. And he persuades his youngest son, Richard, to go to Scotland with Alexander Jr. and with David Tate. He wants Richard to have a good education. Okay? And so these three boys, accompanied by Martin Weatherford, are going to go to Scotland. That's a pretty good voyage up from Bahamas to Scotland during the early 1790s. And once they get here, Richard hands off the boys to Lesher McGilvery, an old business partner he had not seen since they'd all been deported around 1783 time period. So they had a good time kind of catching up here. And Martin left and went back to the Bahamas. And the three boys go to school here in Scotland. Okay? In 1797, Alexander Jr. has the flu and he dies from it. David Tate is homesick and he wants to come home. And Richard Weatherford from the Bahamas had found a young lady that he fell in love with and he married her. And he kind of wants to go back to Bahamas. They kind of homesick too. And so the three kids, I should say the three kids, David Tate, Richard Weatherford, and his new bride are going to leave Scotland and come back to Nassau, Bahamas, where Martin Weatherford lives. And Martin tells Richard, why don't you go on with your new wife to America and get you a place to live? You are an American citizen. I'm the loyalist. You're not. And you have all rights to be there. And so Richard and his new wife and David come back to Pensacola on Patton and Leslie's ships, who Martin Weatherford had worked for, and they make their way into Alabama. They go up toward the Coosa River, where Charles Weatherford had a large horse farm. He's the first Alabamian who brought Arabian horses into Alabama, and he had a big, huge horse racing facility up here. He made his money off of horse racing. And Charles told Richard, I've got property in Greene County, Georgia that I will give to you. The little place is called Sparta. And why don't you go here and settle with your new bride and create your new family? In 1800, they have moved over into Georgia to a little town called Sparta, where they had my great-great-great-grandfather in 1800. David Tate came back to Alabama, one of the most educated boys in the country. But because he had Indian lineage in his family, they still saw him as being an Indian. One drop of Indian blood made you an Indian. And so these folks here realized, as far as we go with education, we'll always be an Indian. Okay? They always were looked down upon. By the way, David Tate is going to become really good friends with a lot of people, including Andrew Jackson when he's here in Florida. David Tate also helps his little nephew get into West Point Academy through John Adams, who's a founder of West Point Academy. And so you're going to start seeing a lot of things happen here in this time period. If you go in my lecture notes, I got the full story of the McGilverys and the Tates and the Winacks and the Weatherfords all in that lecture series. You can go and read through all that stuff and see what all transpired. I'm thinking that maybe one day I'll offer all this stuff to a Hollywood production company and make a movie that deals with the Creek Indians of the Southeast and the Creek Indian War, which involved pirates and all kinds of interesting people. And it'd be a great movie to be shot. It ended up with the Battle at New Orleans in January of 1815. And I think it'd be a great way for people to learn history here by having motion pictures that are totally historically accurate. Don't go through and put any puff and whimsy in it. Make it the way it was, the way people lived and so forth in this time period. Okay? So the Native Americans are trying to find a way to coexist with the white folks who come in here, and a lot of folks intermarry. Okay, and that's what Sahoy and the Creek Indians did. They intermarried here. By the way, when Andrew Jackson comes in here in the Creek Indian War and he destroys a lot of these Indian villages, he is destroying people who are just as American as he is. When he takes out Indians in 1831 in the Indian removal policies, and 1835 and 1837 have the Trail of Tears going across the country. These folks were more American than the ones who came in to replace them. It's really interesting. You look at all this. I mean, now with the DNA testing, we're finding out how much African American is mixed in with Southern bloodlines. A lot of these white Southerners have African roots. I'm 2% African, and it's interesting. We always thought that we was going to be 2% Native American because of William Weatherford. We had nothing to do with William Weatherford. We all came out of England with Richard and his new bride. We had nothing to do with them. So I have no bloodlines that are actually Indian, but I do have that African bloodline, and I believe that Martin Weatherford's second wife was a Native American, was an African woman who lived on his plantation, and he chose her to be his new wife. So it's interesting. You look at all this stuff. I want to guarantee you something. I about believe that all these people in the South who are extremely racist do not realize that they do have African lineage. And I'd love to get the KKK all lined up and give them blood tests and find out who all is African descendants, and really mess up their agenda by doing so. All right. So guys, they're trying to find a way here to make sure that everybody is part of the system, and that everybody is counted. Everybody is allowed to go to the table to sit, and we're still working on that. We're not there yet. Some folks are left out and they don't have a chance at the table. Okay, I'm going to end the lecture here that deals with the culture of colonial North America, and y'all can read the lecture notes, and you can go through the videos I put on Blackboard, and you'll have a source of information. Okay, I will see y'all next time for the next lecture.